Okay, welcome everyone to the first weekly GEO500 wrap. We have Robert Cheatham on the line today as well. He's going to take us through a weekly wrap for Japan after we get through these initial numbers for the stocks of the GEO500. So the benchmark is the S&P 500. That did relatively well considering everything else this week, gaining 1% as of about half an hour ago. The GEO500 lost 5%. It was even worse, though, for the pure play geospatial companies, the so-called GEO100, because there are around about 100 of them. Those dropped 7%. The Esri partners did even worse. They dropped 9%. The Geo Awesome Top 100, they did even worse, dropping 13%. As you might expect, the founder and CEO-led geospatial companies, they did a bit better overall, only dropping by 2%. The SPACs, and there was a whole slew of them, especially in the Earth observation space around 2022, they dropped 4% for the week. And the worst vertical overall was spatial databases, and that's largely because of a terrible quarterly earnings report from Oracle. So that vertical dropped overall 15%, and so did Oracle. The best vertical was semiconductors, a standout in a sea of red this week. They gained 4%. The worst company was Track Group in the device vertical, dropping 43%. The best company was one overall, which isn't so great, but hey, we'll hand it to them for this week. Airway, they're in the indoor navigation vertical. They gained 66%, and we're actually one of the first podcast guests, funnily enough. The highest price to earnings ratio for the week is Rainbow Robotics, a rather fantastic, actually, Korean autonomous systems vertical component. They're at a price to earnings ratio of 9,000, so 9,000 years of earnings to pay for the company. The lowest price to earnings ratio is an interesting one, actually, Lyft in the location-based service vertical at 2 years of earnings to pay for the company. And then just as a marker of the sample size here, so the GEO500 companies stand at 518. So that's both adjacent geospatial companies and pure play. 518, as I said, and the GEO100 companies, so the pure play ones currently stand at 115. All right, so that's the wall of numbers for you. I wanted to go through three interesting announcements for the week amongst these companies. So we had Google DeepMind stating that they can predict soccer player movements up to 8 seconds in advance. So this is really interesting and continues the theme of using things like machine learning and the modern AI tools to predict things in a spatial sense further in advance than otherwise has been the case. There was a theme of that with the episodes with Alex Merrows, predicting the weather twice as far in advance as regular physics models. So interesting to see that that's also happening in soccer player movements. And then Google Earth also made an interesting announcement that for subscribers to the pro tiers of Google Earth, there are some extra infrastructure layers extracted from Street View imagery. So you can get stop signs, speed limit signs, manhole covers, stormwater drains as layers for if you're paying extra as a Google Earth subscriber. And finally, as I sort of foreshadowed, there was a terrible earnings announcement from Oracle. They went from a price of around 200 to around 180 in a matter of a day. Because according to Zacks, investors reacted negatively to the company's aggressive capital spending plans and large equity fundraise that raised dilution concerns. So that's the numbers, as it were, from the GEO500. Over to you, Robert, for digging in on a country that has a lot of very interesting companies in the GEO500, Japan.
Thanks so much, Will. That's a really interesting rundown. I'm going to necessarily have a much more Japan-focused take on this. First, though, I wanted to reflect on how the SpaceX IPO today might have actually impacted folks in Japan. SpaceX actually agreed earlier this week to allocate many more of its shares to Japanese retail investors for IPO day today, increasing from what was originally only $500 million to increasing that multiple times, and most recently this week to $2.5 billion. There's a huge surge in demand from Japanese retail investors. And one thing that your readers and listeners may not be aware of is that Japanese households have $15 trillion in savings and assets, almost 50% of which, more than $7 trillion at the beginning of the year anyway, is in cash. So when they see something that's interesting to them, they go after it in a pretty big way. And Japan is a little bit unique in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of major IPOs. The last major IPO in Japan was SoftBank back in 2018. And Japan also has a very streamlined IPO process if you're an outsider. So they offer something called a public offering without listing, or POWL. And it makes it relatively little paperwork for an IPO in the United States or Europe to also offer it in parallel in Japan. So demand already far exceeds the number of shares allocated to Japan, like probably similar to the United States and other markets. And so retail investors will end up in a lottery, but nonetheless, huge amount of demand and huge amount of capacity. The other major news was last night, today Japan time, but last night here in the United States, the H3 rocket, which is Japan's flagship national rocket, had its first return to flight since launch failure in the end of December. So this is a first from a number of perspectives. It is the return to flight, but it's the first flight of what's called the Type 30. The H3 actually has multiple configurations. The Type 30 is one that has no solid rocket boosters on the side. And this was the first flight for that. They're testing, and it seems to have been a successful test. They had a simulator payload for a heavy payload that caused the failure or was the result of the failure in December. That failure, they determined, and JAXA is remarkably transparent in terms of the level of detail that they provide. But in case your listeners are interested in this, the source of the problem was not the satellite, not the rocket, not the engines, but a unsung component, an attachment, the adapter, payload adapter mechanism. And there's like an aluminum honeycomb set of pieces that the satellite sits on. They're part of a conic adapter, and the satellite sits on top of that. In the manufacturing process, there was some kind of heating past tolerances that caused a delamination that, under conditions of launch and then the explosive process of removing the fairing, caused the satellite, which was one of the heavier satellites the H3 can lift, to collapse the payload adapter, crush a fuel line to the stage 2, and then topple off the top of the rocket. So a whole new failure mode was discovered by JAXA and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. In any event, they figured all of this out over the last little less than 6 months, tested fixes, and this launch yesterday was to test out all of that. They also had 6 civilian research and technology demonstration payloads on there. The return to flight went very successfully, as far as we can tell so far. All of the satellites were deployed on time. Both the payload simulator that was testing this fix and the 6 smaller satellites. The small satellites were really just piggybacking. They're tiny little CubeSats attached to the side of this payload simulator. There were 6 of them. There were a couple that are particularly interesting. One is it's actually 2 halves, and when they get into orbit, they're going to separate out, spooling out a 1 kilometer tether that then a robot will travel along between this tether. And they're going to be testing using a tether mechanism like this to be able to sweep debris out. So this tether will be able to deploy a net, and then they're going to simulate sort of catching that and then potentially discarding that for removal of debris. So pretty crazy.
An orbital cleanup robot. Sounds
Yep.
awesome.
Yeah. So we certainly need it. But as you know, I mean, the H3 being grounded has been a big deal. Japan had a whole slew of launches that were planned this year. But as you know, like Starship is grounded right now. Vulcan is grounded right now. Blue Origin just dramatically blew up and is obviously going to be grounded for some time. ISAR hasn't flown yet. Really, there's just like Falcon 9, Ariane 6, and maybe Rocket Lab Electron. So
The
there's a
Russians
lot of
don't have
pressure.
one?
Obviously, Russia and China, yeah. But in terms of the outside Russia-China market, so there was a lot of pressure on JAXA to get this flying again, and I'm sure they're pretty happy about the results. So some of the bigger payload launches they need to get up this year are going to be 2 cargo trips to this International Space Station, the MMX Martian Moons Explorer mission to Mars, which is pretty cool. They're going to be visiting Phobos and Deimos around Mars and hopefully getting a sample return. And then the 6th of the QZSS geolocation satellites. Japan has half a dozen other or more private sector launch companies. They're in various stages of development that your listeners may not be aware of. One is Space One. They've had 3 failed Kairos launches over the past few years, but there are others. Innovative Space Carrier is based up in Hokkaido Spaceport and is aiming for a 2028 launch. Mjolnir Spaceworks just raised this week 1.7 billion yen in a Series B. Iwaya Giken isn't going to go to space. They instead have a stratospheric pressurized balloon that you're seeing here on the screen. Astro X is building what they're calling a raccoon. So this is a rocket balloon. The balloon will take the rocket up to stratospheric height, and then the rocket will fire off. This is their test rig that they used to test the rocket a couple months ago. Then there's some a raccoon.
That is an awesome technical term,
isn't it? So, and then there's some dark horses like Honda, who demonstrated last year a reusable rocket that they're continuing to develop, kind of on their own schedule, I think. So those are a few of that's kind of the rocket launch news. The H3 getting up is a big deal. It unlocks a whole bunch of launches over the rest of this year. Another big space company in Japan is IHI Corporation. They manufacture a little bit like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, a rocket called the Epsilon, and many parts and components for other rockets, space stations, and spacecraft. They're a big contractor in Japan. So they got hit this week with a 5-month banning for bidding on contracts to JAXA. It's based on some improper billing. Fortunately, they reported it. They found their own improper billing based on some falsified maintenance reports to JAXA. So JAXA did an investigation, found 14 incidents of it going back to 2016, and and as much as 60 million yen in improper billing. So they're going to have a bit of a pause on their ability to bill for contracts. This is ticker 7013 on the Tokyo Exchange, or IHICY if you buy it as an ADR, but they're not having a good time. They peaked, their all-time stock price high was in March. They are a big defense contractor, but they've had a pretty steady fall since then, despite pretty strong earnings. So probably fallen 50% since March. So that's IHI. There were a number of other developments that affect everyone in technology, geospatial platforms, and AI. There have been a number of submarine cuts over the last few years, both between Japan and Korea and between Japan and Taiwan, particularly around Taiwan. It's kind of a recurring infrastructure problem. This is the most recent one was in April 2026 when the Matsu Islands cable was cut. This is the 3rd cut in 4 years on the same cable.
Is this just
Mysterious.
mishaps at sea, or because it reminds me
Well,
of, the Baltics and the Russians, dragging an anchor to annoy the Europeans?
yeah, causation is really hard, but curiously, there was a mysterious Chinese salvage vessel called the Hai Honggong 66, which was took an
There's
unusual
always one of those.
meandering, some kind of unusual meandering path right near the cable, right as it was cut. So every time you lose one of these, it's a $1 to $3 million cost to repair it at least. And the worst part is that booking a repair vessel often takes months because there just aren't enough of them. So,
God, you got me thinking
uh,
about the task though. Like, it must be a really interesting challenge, to actually repair a severed submarine cable.
yeah, yeah, particularly because it's fiber. So there's specialty ships that do that kind of thing. So Taiwan is actually pursuing, they're trying to think about ways to mitigate this. They're pursuing LEO satellite backups. Japan is trying to apply AI techniques for detecting um, these kinds of curious ship movement patterns. Um, but more importantly, 17 nations came together this week to launch what they're calling the GUIDE Subsea Cable Protection Framework, the Guided Principles for Underwater Infrastructure Defense Exchanges GUIDE. So it was launched recently at the Shangri-La Dialogue, but it's going to be a voluntary framework. Japan isn't yet a member, but several Asian countries have already signed, and hopefully will help to do information sharing and establish better norms about caring for, repairing, and avoiding damage to both telecom and energy cables.
You mentioned a Leo solution or a backup. You've got me thinking about that startup with a tether between two satellites. Surely that's going to be the source of the same problem in low Earth orbit. So-
Might very well be, yeah. If you had someone snipping cables trying to remove debris, I don't know. May not be the same attraction that taking out a communication system would be, but and then the other thing that's kind of an ongoing dull roar that may or may not make it to people's top of their news feed is rare earth competition. Japan's actually been facing this for some time. China first used its kind of rare earth trump card back in 2014, so that was a shot against Japan, but not against anyone else. So that was a shot across the bow at the time. Access to rare earths were restored after that, but Japan got the message and has been working for ever since then. So more than 10 years to diversify its rare earth supply chain, but it's still got a ways to go. It's still more than 60% reliant on China rare earths. It's done a number of things to mitigate it. It bought an Australian rare earth mine several years ago and now refines those rare earths in Malaysia. But when Prime Minister Takaichi made a statement about potentially backing up Taiwan in the case of an invasion last year, it made the Chinese very cross, and they it was rhetoric, but in January this year, they said they were going to blacklist 20 Japanese major corporations because Japan is quote unquote rearming itself. Um, Now, Japan's rearmament doesn't look anything like China's rearmament, but nonetheless, that was the accusation. And so those 20 companies were blacklisted, and then 20 others were made conditional on export approval in advance. So here's a chart of rare earth exports to Japan over the last since January, and you can see, well, going back a couple of years actually, you can see in April, March and April, those bans really hit, and imports have plummeted. This is going to be a real problem. Japan's pursuing mitigation in a number of ways. Recycling is a key one. It's pushing diversification via a trade with Mercosur and Global South official development assistance. But it's going to be a pretty big supply chain problem going forward. China still accounts for about half of Japan's auto parts imports, and it has a big impact on its economic security. Now, this really affects semiconductors, certainly rockets, satellites, all use rare earths as key parts of the supply chain.
Yep, there
Japan
we go. So
also has.
we've got a link to all those GNSS semiconductor companies in
Oh,
the
great.
GEO500. So yeah,
Terrific.
glad to have a link there.
So Japan's also launched a rare earth mining project at 6,000 meters below the ocean. So off the shore of an island called Minami Torishima. It's one of the furthest islands from Tokyo on the Japanese archipelago. So they did a test bore in January, and they're now back. So they're essentially scooping up deep sea mud from very, very deep locations, and then bringing it to the island to do some initial refining, and then taking some of the semi-refined ore back to Japan. But it's apparently quite rich in rare earth, and one part of its ongoing effort to mitigate this impact from China's ban.
Okay, and that would bring up the Japanese stocks in the hydrographic survey vertical in the GEO500. I've got a good number of those, generally speaking, in that index, but a lot of them are from Scandinavia. Fugro's in there from the Netherlands as TGS, but I don't have any hydrographic surveying publicly traded companies from Japan. So you're making me think I should go digging.
Okay, I could take a look at it myself at some point. I don't know any off the top of my head. This ship is not a commercial ship; it's a government research ship. The goal is to use this government ship to figure out the process and the mining, and then gradually build into a more production, commercial-ready operation.
Nice.
And then the other news this past week was a $20 billion critical minerals initiative by the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States around Indo-Pacific maritime surveillance and critical minerals collaboration. So a lot of action and interest on that front.
Okay, again, so you're focused on supply chains, really is shining through, Robert. I understand you have a massive spreadsheet mapping hundreds, if not more, of these companies. Or
Yeah,
database,
I think
really.
I'm close to 300 of them, maybe 100 of which are publicly traded. And I'm still getting started. I have then a long list of another 100 or more that I haven't had the time to do the research to add to the database yet. But yeah, it's coming along. It's one of the things I use as a resource for my newsletter and other Japan-related work.
Yep, so that's the Japan Earth Observer newsletter. Okay, it's interesting to hear this, that you've got 100, because I've got about 50. But I think that sort of illustrates the difference between your effort and mine. You're more about, for example, you went into rare earths. I'm less about that. All the rules for entry into the GEO500 or the GEO100 are something directly related to geospatial. So, for example, that's why I was talking about hydrographic surveying. That's how, one of these companies or the things you mentioned could get in. Nevertheless, I really love the broader context. And it really matters what you're saying, for example, about rare earths in, for example, the supply chain for then the GNSS semiconductor manufacturing, which is another group of companies. Something else that stood out for me, a couple of things really. I loved your point that basically a huge number of Japanese households just have, it sounded like almost trillions of dollars, if not billions, to just deploy anytime anything interesting catches their eye. So that was really interesting to hear. And also that, the standard grumbles that are happening all over Twitter about people's SpaceX IPO requests not being fully filled. The same gripes, it sounds like, probably in Japan. And another thing I also liked how you just able to spontaneously comment on actually a good proportion of the world's launch capacity being out of commission presently. Obviously, you're a keen follower, generally speaking, of space launch. That's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, even the Falcon 9 is scaling back its the number of launches this year. So there's a lot more demand than there are launch currently, which is probably helping to drive share prices for companies like Rocket Lab that are both launching and have like rockets like the Neutron under development.
Okay, so what is the Rocket Lab equivalent in Japan?
Probably a
Or the
mix
SpaceX
of,
equivalent?
yeah, I don't know about an equivalent. They're all further down the development cycle. There's certainly, like, Japan wants to, as a nation, be able to support at least 30 launches a year by the early 2030s. The H3 with current infrastructure probably can't pull that off
I
on
guess
its
I was,
own.
yeah, what I was meaning was, is there a private rocket launch company in Japan that, or a
Yeah.
non-government one,
So
that has any sort of a steady launch cadence?
no one's got a steady launch cadence. There haven't
Okay.
been any successful commercial launches. The ones I mentioned earlier that are going after it are Space One, Innovative Space Carrier, and Mjolnir Spaceworks, all with kind of different takes on it. And then
So three
Honda,
companies.
Honda
Four.
kind of out in left field, but unclear what their agenda is.
Okay. All right. Great. So there's four to keep an eye on. Okay. Great. So we've got the last item here, which is sort of general market developments. I've got a few items that have come up related to actually the second worst performing vertical of the past week, which was the CAD or BIM, computer aided design or building information modeling stocks. So the one that most people know about is Autodesk. There's also Bentley, PTC, Nemetschek. There's even ZWSoft, a Chinese company in that corner of the GEO500, as it were. So I guess I was wondering, why these companies, which essentially drive the built environment, a huge proportion, if not, every single modern building really, and every renovation of any significant structure in the modern world involves the use of these companies. Why then has there been a significant contraction of around 14% in the past week? And more broadly, if you just look at, for example, if we go to, this is the SpaceX chart as we're, heading into the last half hour of the market. It's got significantly come off, but I'll return to that later. Let's just bring up the ADSK chart. So things haven't been so great for the most significant stock in the CAD or BIM vertical lately, as you can see. So I wanted to look at some developments on Twitter or X that help us begin to understand why this is happening. So Claude Fable has kept coming up on X in the past week. And this is essentially an AI-driven or generative approach to, essentially the message is that generative AI has come to the BIM stocks. So what we've got here as an animation is basically the result of someone giving a prompt to Fable from Claude, and they've got, a working, credible animation and actually 3D model good enough for further work such as manufacturing. Come back for a V8 engine here. And in a similar vein, NVIDIA have a solution that relates to building design. I won't bore you with extra details there, but just to show you, we've got, it's as simple as that. NVIDIA is coming for, effectively, Autodesk, PTC, Bentley, Nemetschek, ZWSoft's market. So what's the next one? Another really cool one was essentially Claude Fable one-shotted a 3D computer game. The point is that, all of the 3D models, the digital twins, the standard, visual media delivery that comes with infrastructure projects when you've got a new highway, a new bridge, a new hospital, whatever, that might take the visual media team of a very expensive, engineering consultancy weeks to prepare. Well, you've got an NVIDIA and Claude powered replacement here that generates in, $1,200 worth of tokens and half an hour's wait time, something that you could imagine selling to a client. So I thought that was some interesting signals coming out of people's interactions on social media that help understand why there's been this significant contraction of around 14% in the past week alone for the BIM and CAD stocks. So as I mentioned in the invite for this inaugural GEO500 Weekly Wrap, we would be remiss, and Robert, you've already mentioned it, to miss out on just in the wrap up talking about SpaceX. So why does SpaceX matter for the GEO500? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. Actually, I can think of three. The one that's interesting is the positioning, navigation, and timing vertical, and a company. There's several companies in there that have gone on a bit of a tear. For example, NextNav. Recently, if we go just the yearly chart, so they've gone up like a rocket ship, pardon the pun, and that's because there's an initiative from the US government for making the GNSS solution in the US, so GPS, and positioning more broadly, more resilient. And that's because, in the standard news in war zones around the world is jamming and spoofing, which basically makes these faint signals from 20,000 miles away from the GNSS system that's in use inoperable, and navigation therefore hazardous. So NextNav, for example, is a company that has alternative positioning solutions to accompany GPS. Why does SpaceX matter? Well, as you might imagine, with their incredible Starlink constellation, they're also capable of meter level positioning with the Starlink constellation as it stands, without any further technology or algorithms or modifications to that solution. So that is interesting, and is therefore why we should be thinking about it in terms of the GEO500. Of course, they're interesting from the perspective of Earth observation satellite launches, and for example, the Planet constellation is dependent on them. And there was a SpaceX Falcon 9 launch this morning to accompany the IPO, the first day of trading today. Also, they are interesting because Grok itself does. And I should go to the minute chart to make this more interesting. Grok does spatial analysis like every other generative AI solution. So therefore, we have to consider them as a component for the GIS software vertical. And last of all, there's a significant amount that SpaceX does for the Department of War, and in a defense or war context, which you can imagine just from a communications perspective. I think, for example, there was a significant development in the Ukraine war when Elon Musk decided to turn off for a period Starlink in a certain part of that region. So for these reasons, SpaceX is interesting and relevant to the GEO500, and I've chosen to add them to the GIS software vertical. That's simply because that's the most straightforward way, because people can immediately start doing spatial analysis, and regular folk, which is important, people who don't have a GIS background, can immediately start doing quite thoroughgoing spatial analyses against the Grok interface. And also, there is no commercial offering technically from a positioning, navigation, and timing perspective. It is possible, but currently, as far as I'm aware, they don't sell a PNT solution. That's really any comments there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add one other element to that. In a little bit flying below the radar, so to speak, is SpaceX operates what they call Star Shield. Star Shield is a dedicated defense and intelligence constellation of Earth observation satellites. So they're actually imaging SAR and optical, I think, and delivering it straight to the U.S. Department of Defense and the National Reconnaissance Office.
Oh, I totally didn't realize that. Okay, so then I have to. Okay, that's it's really difficult to figure out which vertical it belongs in, because often there's not
Sure.
a breakdown in public documents. But if
Yeah.
I mean, often Department of War contracts are going to be quite lucrative. I
Hmm.
would default then to them being in the what I'm calling the shortening the kill chain vertical,
Yeah.
or otherwise known as the GeoInt or Geospatial Intelligence vertical.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have synthetic aperture radar and optical satellites or sensors
Uh,
on the same satellite.
yeah, I don't know a ton. It's in low Earth orbit. It's a pretty big constellation.
Wow.
It is built custom for the Department of Defense, so it's not dual use. And it's built to pretty strict requirements. I don't know that there's a ton of information about the payload, but my understanding is it had both SAR and optical, and then it's got optical intersatellite links as well
Yep.
for improving transmission of data between satellites and
So
the
it's the
ground.
same as Starlink.
It's probably leveraging Starlink,
Okay.
if not, using some components from Starlink.
Amazing. Okay, I feel like just on that basis, it'd be great if I could keep you as a regular co-host. Robert, you're obviously an absolute, you're a fountain of knowledge here. I think you've got. I can only go so far in my efforts to be across 29 verticals and 500 plus companies and
Of, of course.
30 plus countries. And I think you're also, again, showing us your experience, lengthy experience as an entrepreneur in geospatial. So yeah, thanks for those contributions.
My pleasure.
All right. I think, as a final sort of observation, just looking at the chart, things were looking pretty rosy at one point. In the first couple of hours of trading for SpaceX, we got up to what, 16, 17, basically 18% above the offering price. It's given back basically 10% of that. So yeah, there's 18 minutes of trading left to go for the day. But yeah, I think, oh no, as we speak, it's going down. There's a 20-minute delay anyway in this data. But hey, technically they're in the green. So interesting start of trading for the world's largest IPO, which is relevant to the GEO500.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks once again, Robert. Great first episode.
Thank you, Will. Take care.